Not all storms rage in the skies. Some storms live quietly in the hearts of those who've lost everything. On the coldest winter morning, when hope seemed buried beneath endless snow, a broken man opened his door and found an injured German shepherd standing there, eyes full of stories untold and courage unbroken. Stay with us, because what happened next didn't just change a life. It rekindled a soul and proved that even in life's darkest winters, a new spring is always waiting. The blizzard had descended over the Rocky Mountains with a ferocity that even the seasoned locals hadn't expected. Wind howled through the jagged peaks, sweeping across the pines like a furious, unseen predator. Thick snow fell in relentless waves, blanketing every visible path, every familiar landmark erasing the world in an ocean of white. In the small, isolated community of Silver Pine Ridge, perched precariously at an elevation of 9,000 feet, life had ground to a frozen halt. Few dared step outside, and those who did were swallowed by the storm's merciless embrace. At the farthest edge of the settlement stood an old timber cabin, smoke spiraling from its stone chimney, a lone beacon against the wrath of winter. This was the home of Jack Miller, a 52-year-old former firefighter. Broad-shouldered and weathered by years of service and loss, Jack wore solitude like an old familiar coat. His face, marked by deep-set lines and a thick beard now peppered with gray, rarely showed warmth since his wife Mary Ann passed away 3 winters ago. His eyes, a faded storm gray, mirrored the skies outside, cold, distant, and heavy, with memories that refused to melt away. Once a man of action, Jack had retreated from the world after Mary Ann's sudden death from a heart condition. The mountains, unforgiving yet predictable, had become his only companions. That evening, as the blizzard roared like a caged beast outside, Jack sat by the stone hearth, a battered copy of The Call of the Wild resting on his lap. His cabin creaked and groaned under the pressure of the wind, but inside the air was thick with the scent of burning cedar and a rare, fleeting peace. He sipped on a chipped mug of strong black coffee, eyes fixed on the flames dancing before him, when the sound came, a faint, desperate scratching at the door. At first he thought it was the wind playing tricks, another phantom of the storm. But then came the soft, almost imperceptible whine, a sound so frail and forlorn that it pulled at something buried deep within him. Jack rose slowly, his heavy boots creaking against the wooden floor. Grabbing the flashlight from the mantel, he approached the frost-coated door and cautiously peered through the fogged glass. Through the swirling snow, barely visible in the dim glow of his porch light, stood a dog, large, regal even in its broken state. It was a German shepherd, but far thinner than any healthy animal should be. Its once proud coat was matted with ice and dirt, tufts of black and tan fur clinging stubbornly against the storm. The dog's right front leg hung at an awkward angle, a fresh wound darkening the snow beneath its feet. But what struck Jack most were its eyes, deep amber pools filled not with fear or aggression, but with exhaustion and silent pleading. Jack's mind raced through 1,000 warnings. Wolves roamed these mountains. Strays sometimes turned feral. But this creature didn't carry the wild menace of a predator. Instead, it stood trembling, every breath visible in the frozen air, waiting. Against years of hard-earned caution, Jack cracked open the door. "Easy, boy," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. The dog took a hesitant step forward, collapsing almost immediately onto the porch. As it lay there, Jack caught sight of a metal tag dangling from the tattered leather collar around its neck. He crouched, squinting against the snow and faint light. Scratched and worn nearly smooth, the tag bore a faint engraving. "Property of Project Haven." Jack's brow furrowed. That name sparked something distant in his memory, an experimental canine training program rumored to have shut down years ago after some scandal. But before he could piece it together, the dog let out another soft whimper, eyes fluttering shut from exhaustion. Without further hesitation, Jack gathered the limp body into his arms. The shepherd was surprisingly light for its size, ribs painfully prominent under its coarse fur. Jack brought him inside, laying him gently near the fireplace. As the warmth reached the dog's frozen body, it shuddered violently, a reflexive fight for life. Jack worked quickly. He stoked the fire higher boiled water and rummaged through his battered first aid kit. Despite having no formal veterinary training, his years as a firefighter taught him enough about treating wounds under pressure. He carefully examined the dog's injured leg, a deep gash just above the paw, likely from a metal trap. His calloused hands moved gently, cleaning and wrapping the wound with makeshift bandages. While he worked, his mind couldn't help but drift back to the name etched on that tag: Project Haven. It had been a government-funded initiative training dogs for high-risk search and rescue operations in remote environments. But after a tragic avalanche during a test run which resulted in the loss of several handlers and canines, the program was abruptly terminated. What was this dog doing here alone in these mountains, years after the program had ended? The shepherd stirred faintly, eyes fluttering open to meet Jack's. For a brief moment, the storm outside seemed to quiet the walls of the cabin, holding a fragile peace. "You've been through hell, haven't you, boy?" Jack whispered, brushing a trembling hand through the dog's ice-crusted fur. "Well, you're safe now." Outside, the blizzard raged on, but within that small, lonely cabin, the first ember of a bond began to glow, a bond that neither storm nor sorrow could extinguish. Morning broke over the Rocky Mountains with a pale, uncertain light. The storm had passed, but its remnants lingered like ghosts over the snow-covered ridges. Jack Miller stood at the window of his cabin, sipping the last of his bitter coffee, his eyes drawn to the slumbering German shepherd stretched near the hearth. The dog Blaze, as Jack had unconsciously begun to call him, lay curled on a tattered blanket, his breathing shallow but steady. Jack had spent most of the night tending to the animal's wounds, discovering that the injury on the leg wasn't the only damage Blaze had suffered. Beneath the thick matted fur along his right flank, Jack had found a cruelly embedded scar, a deep, jagged line that could only have come from a steel trap. The wound was old, but had clearly reopened during the storm, raw and inflamed. Bandaging it with strips torn from an old flannel shirt, Jack couldn't shake the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. Outside, the snow still lay waist-deep in places, glistening under the hesitant sunlight. Jack pulled on his heavy coat and stepped outside to clear a path toward the old logging road, now barely recognizable beneath the drifts. His breath rose in misty clouds as he worked thoughts of the injured dog inside refusing to leave him. That battered tag, property of Project Haven, was a riddle he couldn't ignore. As he was about to return to the cabin, a faint noise caught his ear, a crunching of snow, deliberate and slow. His hand instinctively reached for the hatchet tucked at his side. From around the bend in the trail emerged a figure struggling against the weight of the snow, but moving with determined grace. The woman was tall and lean, her figure wrapped in a thick dark green parka lined with faux fur. Her face was framed by loose strands of honey blonde hair, escaping from under a knitted beanie, her cheeks flushed from the cold. Sharp green eyes scanned the surroundings with the focus of someone used to wilderness hardship. She looked to be in her early 30s, a mixture of youth and resilience carved into her every feature. Jack lowered his guard, but kept a wary distance. "Morning," the woman called, her voice strong, but edged with exhaustion. "I didn't expect to find anyone this far out." "You and me both," Jack replied gruffly, his voice rough from disuse. "What brings you through a storm like that?" She took a careful step closer. "Emma Clark. I'm with the High Ridge Animal Rescue Station. We've been monitoring the aftermath of the storm, searching for stranded or injured wildlife." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "I caught sight of fresh human tracks and canine prints. Wasn't sure if I should be worried." Jack studied her for a long moment, then gave a short nod toward the cabin. "You might want to see this." Inside, the warmth immediately softened Emma's expression. but her eyes went straight to the injured animal. Dropping to one knee, she removed her thick gloves and gently examined Blaze without hesitation, her movements practiced and precise. "This poor guy," she murmured, running careful fingers over the bandaged leg and along his scarred flank. Blaze stirred at her touch but didn't pull away. His eyes opened briefly, and Jack swore there was a flicker of recognition when Blaze looked at Emma as if some old memory surfaced before retreating into the haze of exhaustion. Emma sat back on her heels and exhaled slowly. "Do you know what that tag means?" she asked, her tone serious. "I've heard of Project Haven," Jack admitted. "Government program, right? Rescue dogs trained for extreme conditions." Emma nodded, her jaw tightening. It was more than that. It was supposed to be the gold standard for canine search and rescue, hyper-specialized training for natural disasters, high-altitude missions, even military support. But there was a tragedy. An avalanche during a training mission killed several handlers and some of the dogs. The program was shut down overnight, and a lot of these animals just disappeared. Jack's frown deepened. "You think Blaze is one of them?" "I'd bet my last dollar on it," Emma replied, her hand resting gently on Blaze's side. This level of discipline, even in pain, his response to human touch, it's all there. And that scar, it wasn't an accident. These dogs were pushed hard, trained under brutal conditions. Some didn't survive it. Jack sat heavily in his old armchair, running a hand through his thick gray hair. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire and Blaze's soft breathing. Emma stood and walked to the window, her green eyes scanning the horizon beyond the snow-drenched pines. "We've been trying to track down as many of these animals as we can, bring them in, rehabilitate them. But it's been years. Most were abandoned or lost during that storm. Some never found their way back." Jack followed her gaze. "And if they weren't found," Emma's shoulders sagged, "they either died out there alone or worse. They turned wild, unable to trust anyone again." Blaze shifted, letting out a low, contented sigh. Despite the pain, his body relaxed under the warmth and care he hadn't known in years. Jack stared at the animal, something inside him softening. "Well, this one found his way back to someone." Emma smiled faintly, her eyes lingering on Blaze. "And maybe that's the first step in saving the rest." The wind had softened, but the air held the sharp bite of winter's grip. It was the third morning since the blizzard had passed, and the landscape lay frozen beneath a thick quilt of snow. Yet inside Jack Miller's cabin, a different kind of storm was brewing. Blaze, the injured German shepherd who had found unexpected sanctuary, began to exhibit behaviors that stirred concern in both Jack and Emma Clark. Blaze had regained some of his strength. His eyes more alert now, but his demeanor had shifted. He often stood by the frosted window, his amber eyes fixed on the distant peaks of the Rocky Mountains. At times he would pace in tight circles near the door, his powerful frame tense, despite the injury that still hindered his right leg. Emma noticed it first, the way his ears twitched at unseen sounds, the way his nose lifted to sniff the air with intense focus. "He's looking for something," Emma murmured, as she crouched beside Blaze, running her fingers gently over his thick fur. "Or someone." Jack stood nearby, arms crossed over his broad chest, his weathered face creased in thought. "Do you think it's just instinct or something more?" Emma shook her head, her honey blonde hair falling loosely from under her beanie. "This isn't random. Dogs from Project Haven were trained to track and find. Even if he's been out here for years, those instincts don't just vanish. He's following a memory." That afternoon, unable to ignore the dog's restless behavior, Jack bundled up and prepared to follow Blaze's lead. Emma joined him, her pack slung over her shoulder, filled with emergency supplies. Despite the snow still waist-deep in many places, they trudged through the harsh terrain with Blaze limping ahead, stopping every few feet to test the air and press his nose to the ground. They climbed toward the lower ridges of the mountains, where the forest thinned and the biting wind swept across the open drifts. After nearly an hour of silent tracking, Blaze came to a sudden stop. His ears flattened, and his posture became still, his gaze fixed on a small clearing ahead. Jack and Emma followed his line of sight and saw at a faint disturbance in the pristine snow a shallow pit half covered by drifting powder. Jack approached cautiously, his boots crunching against the ice. As he brushed away the snow, his gloved hands uncovered a broken, rusted collar. The leather was cracked and brittle, the metal tag nearly worn smooth. But what struck him most was the dark stain frozen into the snow beneath it, a splotch of old dried blood. Emma crouched beside him, her breath hitching as she examined the tag. This is another Project Haven tag, but it's almost unreadable. Jack's jaw clenched. Blaze has been searching for whoever wore this. He turned to the dog, who now sat quietly. A few feet away, his head lowered, eyes filled with something far more complex than instinct. Grief. Recognition. Loss. Emma's green eyes turned somber as she stood. Jack, there's a good chance whoever wore this didn't survive. That blood's old and out here, in this cold. Jack shook his head. Or maybe they're still out there like Blaze was just trying to find their way back. For a long moment, the three of them stood in that silent clearing, the wind tugging at their clothes and the mountains looming in stoic silence. Then Blaze gave a faint, almost inaudible whine and began to limp forward again, following a trail only he could sense. Jack and Emma exchanged a glance, their unspoken agreement clear they would follow him no matter where the path led. As dusk approached and the sky turned to a canvas of steel gray and violet, the trail grew colder, the snow deeper. Blaze pressed on despite his injury, driven by a purpose that neither Jack nor Emma fully understood, but refused to deny. At last, as the light began to fail, they came upon a narrow ravine, a hidden crevice between the rocks where the snow had not settled as deeply. Blaze stopped at the edge, his ears pricking up. Jack followed his gaze and saw faint impressions in the hardened earth beneath a shallow overhang, paw prints old but unmistakable, and among them faint traces of blood smeared across the stone. Emma knelt down, examining the tracks. This is recent, maybe a day or two before the storm hit. Jack felt a heaviness settle over him. Then someone or some dog was here before the storm, injured, alone. Blaze sniffed the air again and let out a mournful howl that echoed through the narrowing gorge. The sound raised goosebumps along Jack's arms. It wasn't just a call. It was a lament. Emma rose slowly. We should mark this location and head back before the light's completely gone. If there's a chance this dog is still alive, we'll need to come back prepared. Jack nodded, but kept his eyes on Blaze, who stood motionless at the edge of the ravine, his gaze never leaving the horizon. Whatever this memory was, whoever it belonged to, it still lingered out there, waiting to be found. They turned back toward the cabin, the night pressing in around them. And though they left the ravine behind, the haunting echo of Blaze's howl seemed to follow them all the way home. The wind had softened, but the air held the sharp bite of winter's grip. It was the third morning since the blizzard had passed, and the landscape lay frozen beneath a thick quilt of snow. Yet inside Jack Miller's cabin, a different kind of storm was brewing. Blaze, the injured German shepherd who had found unexpected sanctuary, began to exhibit behaviors that stirred concern in both Jack and Emma Clark. Blaze had regained some of his strength, his eyes more alert now, but his demeanor had shifted. He often stood by the frosted window, his amber eyes fixed on the distant peaks of the Rocky Mountains. At times, he would pace in tight circles near the door, his powerful frame tense, despite the injury that still hindered his right leg. Emma noticed it first, the way his ears twitched at unseen sounds, the way his nose lifted to sniff the air with intense focus. "He's looking for something," Emma murmured, as she crouched beside Blaze, running her fingers gently over his thick fur. "Or someone." Jack stood nearby, arms crossed over his broad chest, his weathered face creased in thought. Do you think it's just instinct or something more? Emma shook her head, her honey blonde hair falling loosely from under her beanie. This isn't random. Dogs from Project Haven were trained to track and find. Even if he's been out here for years, those instincts don't just vanish. He's following a memory. That afternoon, unable to ignore the dog's restless behavior, Jack bundled up and prepared to follow Blaze's lead. Emma joined him, her pack slung over her shoulder, filled with emergency supplies. Despite the snow still waist-deep in many places, they trudged through the harsh terrain with Blaze limping ahead, stopping every few feet to test the air and press his nose to the ground. They climbed toward the lower ridges of the mountains where the forest thinned and the biting wind swept across the open drifts. After nearly an hour of silent tracking, Blaze came to a sudden stop. His ears flattened, and his posture became still, his gaze fixed on a small clearing ahead. Jack and Emma followed his line of sight and saw at a faint disturbance in the pristine snow, a shallow pit half covered by drifting powder. Jack approached cautiously, his boots crunching against the ice. As he brushed away the snow, his gloved hands uncovered a broken, rusted collar. The leather was cracked and brittle, the metal tag nearly worn smooth. But what struck him most was the dark stain frozen into the snow beneath it, a splotch of old, dried blood. Emma crouched beside him, her breath hitching as she examined the tag. This is another Project Haven tag, but it's almost unreadable. Jack's jaw clenched. Blaze has been searching for whoever wore this. He turned to the dog, who now sat quietly a few feet away, his head lowered, eyes filled with something far more complex than instinct. Grief, recognition, loss. Emma's green eyes turned somber as she stood. Jack, there's a good chance whoever wore this didn't survive. That blood's old and out here, in this cold. Jack shook his head. Or maybe they're still out there, like Blaze was just trying to find their way back. For a long moment, the three of them stood in that silent clearing, the wind tugging at their clothes and the mountains looming in stoic silence. Then Blaze gave a faint, almost inaudible whine and began to limp forward again, following a trail only he could sense. Jack and Emma exchanged a glance, their unspoken agreement clear. They would follow him no matter where the path led. As dusk approached and the sky turned to a canvas of steel gray and violet, the trail grew colder, the snow deeper. Blaze pressed on despite his injury, driven by a purpose that neither Jack nor Emma fully understood, but refused to deny. At last, as the light began to fail, they came upon a narrow ravine, a hidden crevice between the rocks where the snow had not settled as deeply. Blaze stopped at the edge, his ears pricking up. Jack followed his gaze and saw faint impressions in the hardened earth beneath a shallow overhang paw prints, old but unmistakable. And among them, faint traces of blood smeared across the stone. Emma knelt down, examining the tracks. This is recent, maybe a day or two before the storm hit. Jack felt a heaviness settle over him. Then someone or some dog was here before the storm. Injured. Alone. Blaze sniffed the air again and let out a mournful howl that echoed through the narrowing gorge. The sound raised goosebumps along Jack's arms. It wasn't just a call, it was a lament. Emma rose slowly. We should mark this location and head back before the light's completely gone. If there's a chance this dog is still alive, we'll need to come back prepared. Jack nodded, but kept his eyes on Blaze, who stood motionless at the edge of the ravine, his gaze never leaving the horizon. Whatever this memory was, whoever it belonged to, it still lingered out there waiting to be found. They turned back toward the cabin, the night pressing in around them. And though they left the ravine behind, the haunting echo of Blaze's howl seemed to follow them all the way home. The following morning dawned under a heavy, brooding sky. Snow had begun to fall again, light at first, but gaining strength as the wind swept through the mountains. Jack stood outside the cabin, his face turned toward the horizon, sensing the storm that was gathering. They had little time. Inside, the warmth of the hearth barely kept the growing cold at bay. Emma finished wrapping fresh bandages on Shadow's injured leg, while Blaze lay close by his watchful eyes, never straying far from his companion. Emma glanced at Jack as he re-entered, brushing snow from his shoulders. "We need to move," she said quietly, concern etching lines across her forehead. Her green eyes, usually calm and composed, now flickered with anxiety. "If this storm sets in, we'll be stuck for days. Shadow can't survive another cold front without proper medical care." Jack nodded grimly. "We leave now. I'll pack the sled." Within minutes, Jack and Emma had secured the small wooden sled Jack had built for hauling supplies. This time, it would carry Shadow swaddled carefully in blankets to protect her from the biting cold. Blaze, though still limping, insisted on walking alongside them, his strong will refusing to accept the comfort of the sled. As they began their descent down the mountain trail, the snowfall thickened. Visibility dropped rapidly, and the winding path became treacherous with hidden ice patches. Jack took the lead, his strong frame clearing the way through knee-deep drifts. Emma followed close behind, keeping a vigilant eye on Blaze and the sled. Halfway down the trail, Blaze suddenly stopped. His ears perked, his nose lifted to the wind, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. Jack turned sharply, instinctively, placing himself between Emma and the direction Blaze was staring. "Something's out there," Jack muttered, tightening his grip on the hatchet strapped to his side. Then they saw them boot prints in the fresh snow leading off the main trail and disappearing into the dense pine forest. The tracks were recent. Jack crouched and examined them closely. They were larger than Emma's, broader than his own, and the treads were distinctive heavy-duty hunting boots worn down from years of rough use. Emma knelt beside him, her breath visible in the frigid air. "These aren't hikers' tracks. Someone's hunting." Jack's jaw tightened. "Logan Price," he said through clenched teeth. Emma's eyes widened. "You know him?" Jack stood scanning the tree line. "Everyone around these parts knows Logan. He's a poacher, dangerous, ruthless, specialized in rare animals. If he's here, he's not after deer. He's looking for something valuable." Emma's heart sank. Blaze and Shadow. Jack nodded. He must have caught wind that some of the Project Haven dogs survived. The realization settled over them like a second, heavier storm. Blaze growled again, his body tense. Jack motioned for Emma to stay close as he slowly followed the tracks leading deeper into the woods. They moved cautiously, the trees closing in tight. Each creak of snow beneath their boots seemed too loud against the oppressive silence. It didn't take long before they spotted movement ahead, a flicker of camouflage between the trees. Jack signaled for Emma to stop and crouched low behind a fallen log. Peering through the branches, he saw him. Logan Price was a tall, wiry man in his late 40s, with sharp, angular features hardened by years of survival in the wild. His skin was weathered, his face framed by a grizzled beard that did little to soften the predatory gleam in his cold blue eyes. He wore a tattered camouflage jacket, patched over the years, and carried a high-powered rifle slung casually over his shoulder. His boots were caked in snow and mud, his movements deliberate and silent. Logan had the calculated patience of a hunter who never missed his prey. Jack muttered under his breath. "He's tracking something or someone." Emma's fists clenched. "We have to get out of here before he finds us." Jack considered their options. "If we turn back, he'll pick up our trail. We need to draw him away from the cabin. Away from the dogs." Before Emma could protest, Jack stood tall and stepped out from behind the cover. Blaze moved instinctively to his side. Emma gasped but held her position. Logan Jack called his voice deep and steady against the rising wind. The poacher turned his cold gaze, landing on Jack. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. "Well, well, Jack Miller. Didn't expect to see you playing shepherd in these mountains." Jack's fists clenched. "Whatever you're looking for, you're not getting it," Logan chuckled darkly. "That so word is some valuable animals made it out of that little government experiment gone wrong. I'm just here to collect what's owed." "They're not yours to take," Jack growled, stepping forward. Blaze stood firm at his side. Teeth bared his growl, low and threatening. Logan's fingers twitched near his rifle. "I don't think you're in any position to stop me, Jack." Before the situation could escalate further, a sudden gust of wind howled through the trees, sending a fresh flurry of snow between them. Jack seized the moment, grabbed a handful of snow, and flung it toward Logan's face as a distraction. In the split second of confusion, Jack turned and ran back toward Emma and the sled. "Go," he barked as he reached them. Now Emma didn't hesitate. She grabbed the sled's handle and began pulling Shadow through the snow-covered path as fast as she could. Blaze stayed close by her side, his protective instincts fully awakened. Logan's angry shouts echoed behind them, but the thickening snow and gathering storm worked to their advantage. They pushed on, adrenaline overriding the biting cold and fatigue. Jack brought up the rear, his eyes scanning constantly for any sign of pursuit. After what felt like hours, they finally emerged onto the old logging road that would lead them back to the cabin. Exhausted but determined, they pressed forward until the familiar outline of the cabin appeared through the swirling snow. By the time they reached the safety of the cabin, night had fallen, and the storm had returned with full force. Jack bolted the door behind them and collapsed into a chair by the fire, his chest heaving. Emma knelt beside Shadow, checking her condition, while Blaze curled protectively around her once again. Despite the danger, they had made it back. For now, they were safe. The storm had barely settled when trouble came pounding on their door again. It was early dawn, the sky bruised with purple and gray, as snow continued to fall lightly over the frozen landscape. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with unease. Blaze paced near the door, his ears flicking at every faint sound outside. Shadow, still weak but more alert, lay curled near the fire, under Emma's watchful care. Jack was sharpening his old hunting knife, the rhythmic scrape against the whetstone, the only sound cutting through the tense quiet. Emma stood by the window, her breath fogging the frost-covered glass. Her slender frame was tense, wrapped tightly in a thick woolen sweater that looked 2 sizes too big for her. Her usually sharp green eyes were clouded with worry. "He's still out there, Jack," she whispered, her fingers tightening around the edges of the curtain. "Logan won't give up that easily." Jack gave a slow, grim nod. "I know his kind. Men like Logan don't walk away empty-handed. He'll come back, and he'll come back smarter." Before either of them could continue, a sharp, sudden bark cut through the cabin. Blaze was at the door, growling deep in his throat. In an instant, Jack threw on his coat and yanked the door open. Blaze bolted into the swirling snow, his powerful form vanishing into the tree line before either human could react. "Blaze!" Emma cried out, grabbing her jacket and rushing after Jack as he sprinted into the blizzard. The forest swallowed them quickly. The world became a blur of white and gray trees looming like silent sentinels in the mist. Jack followed Blaze's tracks as fast as his legs could carry him, his breath coming out in ragged bursts. Emma kept close behind her boots, struggling through the deep snow. In the distance, faint but growing louder, came the sound of desperate barking, Blaze's voice fierce and relentless. And then another sound, a harsh, cruel laugh followed by the unmistakable yelp of a dog in pain. Jack's heart sank. "Shadow," he muttered, pushing forward with renewed urgency. They broke through a clearing and saw it all unfold. Logan Price stood near a large pine, his long, wiry frame tense as he gripped a metal capture pole, its loop cinched tight around Shadow's neck. Shadow struggled weakly, her hind leg dragging uselessly behind her as she tried to pull away. Logan's face was twisted in a sneer, his ice-blue eyes cold and ruthless under the brim of his weathered hunting cap. "Thought you could hide from me forever," Logan snarled, jerking the pole hard. "You're worth more than my old truck, little girl." Blaze burst into the clearing with a ferocious snarl, his teeth bared and eyes blazing with primal rage. Before Logan could react, Blaze lunged at him, his powerful body colliding with Logan's legs and knocking him off balance. The hunter stumbled backward, losing his grip on the pole. "Get Shadow!" Jack shouted, racing toward the scene. Emma was already there, pulling Shadow free from the loop and cradling her frail body close. Blaze stood over Logan, growling low and dangerous as the man scrambled to his feet, his hands reaching for the rifle strapped across his back. Jack reached him first, tackling Logan to the ground. Years of isolation hadn't dulled Jack's strength. His fists landed hard, fueled by months of pent-up anger and years of regret. But Logan fought back like a cornered animal, twisting and landing a savage elbow into Jack's ribs. A sudden blare of a siren pierced through the forest air. Red and blue lights flickered through the trees as two snowmobiles roared into the clearing. The local sheriff, Deputy Cole Harrington, arrived with his team. Cole was a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s with a weathered but kind face hidden beneath a thick gray beard. His deep voice boomed over the chaos. "Hands where I can see them." Price Logan froze. In that moment of hesitation, Jack pinned him down, wrenching the rifle from his hands and tossing it aside. Blaze stood nearby, teeth bared his body, tense, waiting for any sign of resistance. Deputy Harrington and his deputies swarmed in quickly, restraining Logan and hauling him to his feet. His face still twisted with defiance, turned to Jack one last time. "This isn't over, Miller. You think locking me up will stop it? There are others people who'll pay top dollar for animals like them." Jack's eyes narrowed coldly. "Maybe, but not today." Emma was kneeling by Shadow, tears of relief streaming down her flushed cheeks. "You're safe now," she whispered, her trembling fingers brushing gently over the younger dog's face. Shadow let out a soft, weary sigh, her head resting against Emma's lap as Blaze settled beside them, his body pressed protectively against hers. Deputy Harrington approached Jack. "We've been tracking this man for months," he said with a shake of his head. "Illegal traps, smuggling rare animals, you name it. But you brought him right to us." Jack gave a tired nod. "Just did what had to be done." The storm began to lift as the sun broke faintly through the clouds. It felt like the world itself was exhaling, releasing the tension that had gripped the mountain for far too long. Logan was escorted away, his threats fading into the distance. For the first time in days, the forest felt calm again. The days following Logan Price's arrest passed in a blur of relief and quiet reflection. Snow continued to fall gently across the rugged peaks of the Rockies, but for once the mountains felt less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. Jack Miller stood outside his cabin, the early morning light painting the sky in soft shades of rose and gold. In the distance, the silhouette of Blaze appeared against the snow, standing tall and proud beside the recovering Shadow. Inside the cabin, Emma Clark moved briskly, gathering supplies for the trip back to the newly re-established Project Haven Rescue Center. Her honey-blonde hair was pulled back into a loose braid, a soft smile gracing her tired but radiant face. The harsh lines of worry had softened, replaced by hope. Despite the exhaustion, her green eyes shone with a light Jack hadn't seen before. Project Haven had once been a failed dream, a place abandoned after tragedy. But thanks to Emma's relentless efforts and the support of the local government, it had been brought back to life. Nestled in a valley beyond the eastern ridges, the center now stood as a beacon of second chances, not only for the dogs it would shelter, but for those who had lost their way. Jack watched Blaze trot up to him, his powerful frame moving smoothly despite the lingering limp. His amber eyes held a quiet strength, and his thick coat glistened under the pale sunlight. Shadow padded alongside him, smaller and more fragile her gait, careful but steady. Her once haunted eyes now sparkled with cautious curiosity. "It's almost time," Emma said softly, stepping beside Jack. Her gloved hands cradled a small metal tag she had found among the ruins of the old haven, a symbol of the past and a promise for the future. Jack nodded, but kept his gaze on the horizon. "They deserve better," he murmured. "A place where they're not hunted or left behind." "They'll have that now," Emma assured him. "Because of you." Jack turned toward her, the weight of years reflected in his storm-gray eyes. "No, Emma. Because of you. You never gave up, even when the storms hit hardest." Emma smiled, her cheeks flushed from the cold. Sometimes it takes a storm to remind us what's worth fighting for. Later that morning, they set out toward Project Haven. Jack drove the snowmobile with Emma seated behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist for balance. Behind them, a sturdy sled carried Shadow bundled warmly in blankets, her head poking out to take in the sights. Blaze ran alongside, tireless and free, his breath coming in steady puffs as he kept pace with the machine. The journey was long, cutting through deep forests and winding along frozen rivers. As they neared the valley, the landscape opened into a breathtaking expanse. There, cradled between two towering peaks, stood the New Haven. Its modern wooden structures were simple, but strong smoke curling from chimneys as caretakers moved between buildings. Bright red flags fluttered in the wind, a symbol of safety amidst the wild. Emma's face lit up as they approached. Jack felt a warmth in his chest he hadn't known for years. Waiting at the entrance was a tall woman with a commanding presence. Dr. Sarah Whitmore, the new head of Project Haven, greeted them with open arms. She was a striking figure in her early 40s, with sharp cheekbones softened by a kind smile. Her dark brown hair was tied back under a thick wool hat, and her steel blue eyes spoke of years spent in harsh environments, yet untouched by bitterness. "Welcome back," Sarah said, her voice firm but warm. "We've been expecting you." Emma jumped down and embraced her mentor. "It's finally happening," she whispered. Sarah crouched beside the sled, her experienced hands gently examining Shadow's injuries. "She's a fighter," Sarah murmured. "She'll heal just fine here." Blaze stood nearby, his eyes following every move as if silently asking for permission to stay close. Sarah smiled at him. "And you, Blaze, you've done your duty well." Jack watched the exchange, his chest tightening with a mixture of pride and an unfamiliar ache. Over the past weeks, Blaze had become more than just a survivor. He was a symbol of resilience, of loyalty that endured even the worst storms. That night, as the dogs settled into their new sanctuary, Jack stood alone near the main fence, the wind cool against his face. He stared out at the mountains, his thoughts drifting to Marianne, his late wife. For years, he had closed himself off from the world, convinced that love and purpose had died with her. But standing there, he realized that wasn't true. His heart, though scarred, was still capable of opening again. Blaze approached quietly, pressing his head against Jack's side. Jack rested his rough hand on the dog's broad head, his voice low and steady. "You don't belong behind fences, boy. You belong with me." The next morning, amidst the soft falling snow, Jack signed the adoption papers. Blaze was his now not as a possession, but as a companion. A friend, a reminder that even in the darkest winters, hope could bloom again. As Jack and Blaze prepared to leave Project Haven, Emma stood beside them, her eyes shimmering with unspoken gratitude. "You found your way home, Jack," she said gently. Jack smiled, the first true, unburdened smile in years. "We both did." Together, man and dog turned back toward the horizon, ready to face whatever storms might come, their hearts light and free. Spring arrived gently over the Rockies, brushing life back into the snow-draped world. The thick ice that had gripped the valleys for months now melted into glistening streams that rushed down the mountainsides, bringing with them the sound of renewal. Jack Miller stood on the porch of his cabin, a rare smile pulling at the corners of his weathered face. The air smelled fresh, filled with the crisp scent of pine and wildflowers, daring to bloom through the thawing earth. At his side, Blaze stood tall, his golden coat gleaming under the soft morning sun. Though his gait still carried a faint limp, his movements were purposeful and strong. His amber eyes scanned the horizon with quiet confidence. Since the long winter passed, Jack and Blaze had found a new rhythm, their days filled with purpose far beyond survival. Project Haven had not only reopened, but flourished. With Emma's leadership and the unwavering support of the local community, it had become a sanctuary and a symbol of redemption. The once-forgotten place now bustled with life and hope, and today they were gathering there for something special. Jack adjusted the thick leather harness over Blaze's shoulders. The dog had been officially certified for mountain rescue, a program Jack had reluctantly agreed to join after persistent persuasion from Emma and Dr. Sarah Whitmore. Now standing at the edge of a new beginning, Jack couldn't imagine a life without these missions. Together, they had already saved 2 stranded hikers earlier that month, earning quiet respect from a community that once viewed Jack as a reclusive, broken man. He had become a symbol of resilience, standing shoulder to shoulder with his loyal companion, inspiring others to believe in second chances. Blaze gave a soft bark, breaking Jack's thoughts. Jack chuckled. "Ready to show them what freedom really looks like, boy." They set off toward Project Haven, the trail winding through the blooming valleys and along the edges of cliffs now clear of snow. When they arrived, the center was alive with activity. Children ran laughing across the open fields, and families gathered to watch the day's event, a celebration of new beginnings. Near the main pavilion, Emma stood with Shadow at her side. Shadow had grown stronger, her once gaunt frame now filled out her sable coat thick and shining under the afternoon light. Emma, dressed simply in a cream blouse and sturdy jeans, looked every bit the radiant leader she had become. Her bright green eyes scanned the horizon, lighting up when she saw Jack and Blaze approaching. Shadow caught sight of Blaze and bounded toward him with surprising grace, despite the faint limp she still carried from her old injury. The 2 dogs greeted each other with soft barks and gentle nudges, their bond unbroken by time or distance. Emma approached Jack with a warm smile. "Look at them," she said, her voice full of pride. "They've found their place in the world." Jack nodded, his eyes softening. "So have we, Emma." As the sun began to lower over the peaks, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose, the crowd gathered near a large stone platform overlooking the valley. Dr. Sarah Whitmore, dignified in her tailored dark coat, took the stage. Her commanding presence was softened by the warmth in her steel-blue eyes as she addressed the crowd. "Today, we celebrate more than just the renewal of Project Haven," she began. "We celebrate the resilience of the human spirit, the unbreakable bond between us and these incredible animals who remind us every day of what it means to persevere. Together we've turned tragedy into hope." She motioned toward Blaze and Jack. "Let us honor those who chose to keep walking forward when the path seemed impossible. Jack Miller and Blaze are living proof that even in the harshest winters, spring will always come." Applause echoed through the valley, a sound that seemed to chase away every lingering shadow of the past. As the celebration wound down, Jack, Emma, Sarah, and a few of the close volunteers climbed a familiar trail toward the highest peak overlooking the valley. Blaze and Shadow ran ahead, their bodies outlined against the glowing sky, their joy unrestrained. At the summit, the group stood in silence, watching as the sun dipped behind the snow-capped ridges, flooding the sky with a final brilliant burst of light. The moment was still, the air filled only with the soft sigh of the wind and the steady breathing of those who had fought their way back to life. Jack knelt beside Blaze, running a rough hand through his thick fur. "We made it, didn't we, old friend?" His voice was low, carried off by the breeze. Emma stood nearby, her face turned toward the fading sun. Shadow pressed close to her leg, her head resting gently against Emma's knee. For the first time in a long while, Jack felt complete, not because the journey had been easy, but because it had been real. The pain, the loss, the triumph, they had all led here to this moment of peace. And as the sun disappeared, leaving the world wrapped in the soft embrace of twilight, Jack knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something even greater. A life lived fully, a life shared. In the end, it's not the grand moments that heal us. It's the quiet ones. A gentle nudge from a loyal friend, a warm breath against a weary hand, the silent promise that no matter how lost we feel, we are never alone. Blaze didn't just find a home. He gave Jack his heart back. And maybe that's the greatest miracle of all, that love, even when broken and battered, still knows the way home. If this story touched a tender place in your heart, share it with someone who might be standing at their own closed door, waiting for a sign of hope. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been saved by a love you didn't expect, or met a friend who found you when you couldn't even find yourself? If you believe that love always finds a way, no matter how cold the winter type, love finds a way, in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us of the simple, beautiful truth. Sometimes the smallest hearts teach us the biggest lessons. May you always have a warm place to return to, and someone waiting with open arms when you do.